For the benefit of everybody here, just let me introduce my former colleague, I guess, Professor Richard Moon. Professor Moon is the Distinguished University Professor and Professor of Law at the University of Windsor, and his research areas are in freedom of expression and freedom of conscience and religion. He is the author of many, many law review articles, articles in the less academic presses, and also a number of books. So his forthcoming book is called The Life and Death of Freedom of Expression. It's published by U of T, and I'm assuming that that's the new incarnation of freedom of constitutional protection of freedom of expression, which was published in 2000, and really highlighted Richard as being the preeminent scholar in the area of freedom of expression in Canada. He also has books coming out of Putting Faith in Hate, When Religion is a Source or Target of Hate Speech. That came out in 2018, and another book on freedom of conscience and religion, which first edition was in 2014. His second edition is coming out this year as well. He's the editor of a number of publications, including Law and Religion, Religious Pluralism in Canada, and Religion and the Exercise of Public Authority, and a number of other books, including a sort of intriguing one called The Surprising Constitution, which I may actually have to buy, which is coming out soon from University of British Columbia Press. And he is one of the contributing editors of the main constitutional law casebook in Canada, published by Eamon Montgomery, which is now in its 6th edition. Is that correct?
Something like that.
Yeah. Professor Moon has been the recipient of both law school and university-wide teaching awards, including the Mary Lou Dietz Award for contribution to the advancement of equity in the university and in the community. And he's held a number of academic positions, including being president of the Canadian Law and Society Association, and he's currently the editor-in-chief of the Windsor Yearbook of Access to Justice. So one quick anecdote here, which Richard knows, and it's this. In 1999 or 2000, I received a call from Janet Wright and Associates, and some people may remember that firm. I don't think it exists anymore. And they were academic consultants that hired people, that helped universities hire senior staff. And I got a call, and apparently University of Windsor was interested in me coming in for a visit and perhaps being the new dean of the law school. And so what do you do when you get one of these calls? You, of course, look up the university, right? And you look up the law school, and you see who exactly are you going to have there as a colleague if you're successful in this search process. And obviously, we're going alphabetically. I knew Jeff Berryman, and in fact had spent 10 days with Jeff at a teaching clinic at one point in time. And so I knew him, and I said, oh, that's good. And I went through a bunch of names that I had no idea who they were. And then I got to Professor Richard Moon. Now, I'd never met Dick before, but I knew his writing. And I knew it well because he was a contributor to publications that we did at the University of Alberta, a publication called Constitutional Forum, which Dick has been a contributor to over the years. And I said to myself, okay, I'll go. This is pretty good. They've got Jeff Berryman and they've got Dick Moon, and I think we can make something of the place. And so I did. And so Professor Moon is primarily responsible for me now being a vice president of WURA. I think that's fair to say. All right. So without further ado, I'm gonna ask Dick to launch in here. Basically, he's going to talk for about 20 minutes I may ask a few questions for about 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to everybody to chime in and participate on questions. I think we're going to be stopping around 2 o'clock. So with that introduction, Professor Moon.
All right, thanks, Bruce. Thanks for the introduction. It makes me sound more interesting and more impressive than I think I almost certainly am, but nevertheless. And I will confess, you're right about this book that's coming out from U of T Press. It was supposed to be a second edition of a book I wrote some time ago on free speech, and definitely the publisher thought, no, we need a new name. We need it to sound like a new book, et cetera. And the reality is that in 2000, social media was not really a thing. And so an awful lot has changed since 2000. So, of course, a book about freedom of expression is very different now than one written 24 years ago. In any event, with that said, so I've been asked to say a little bit about freedom of expression on campus issues that arise. So let me start by just saying, when we think about freedom of expression in the larger public sphere, the freedom that is protected under our Constitution, for example, it's subject to very few limits. Canadian law restricts expression that amounts to hate speech or obscenity or threats, false advertising, different kinds of content restrictions like that. But there aren't very many restrictions of that kind, and that stems from our commitment to freedom of expression. Now, expression, however, may be subject to different and perhaps even greater limits when it occurs in particular institutional settings. So, racial generalizations, for example, or insults that may not breach hate speech law, nevertheless, when they occur in a particular workplace or within the schools or locations like that, they may be considered unlawful harassment or discrimination of different forms. And when you're thinking about employees in a workplace, they are a captive audience, and they can't easily avoid repeated insults that may be directed to them from coworkers, managers, and so forth. So different standards are going to apply in an ordinary workplace because it's closed, it's hierarchical, and because the particular function that may be performed can be undermined by these forms of speech. So importantly, I guess the workplace is not ordinarily a democratic forum, a place of free and open discourse, even if employees do or should retain some rights to express their views within that context. Okay. When it comes to universities, I guess the first important thing to note is that our courts, the Supreme Court of Canada in particular, have said that universities are not government actors, which means they are not subject to obligations under the Charter of Rights. Now, there are some judicial decisions that raise the question of whether universities in performing certain functions or in certain respects might be subject to the Charter, and that is taking shape, and we're not really sure where that stands now. But when a university exercises coercive power, for example, should it be subject to the Charter? But I think for now, it's safe to say, as a general matter, that a university is not a government actor, and so charter rights don't directly apply to universities. Nevertheless, when speaking about a university, it understands itself as committed to freedom of expression. I mean, our institution in particular has a freedom of expression policy. It's true that that was something that was required by the provincial government several years ago, but even before that, there's no question the university understood itself as committed to freedom of expression within the university context or environment. Okay. But it's important to know and to recognize that the university is not simply a public forum like the streets and the parks. And at the same time, it's not an ordinary workplace or a place of business. It's a place of learning. It has a particular mission, the discovery, dissemination of knowledge through research and teaching. And this purpose makes it different from other workplaces. And this difference is reflected in the institutional commitment say, to academic freedom, freedom to explore and advance ideas and information, some of which may be controversial or unconventional in character. Okay, so academic freedom, which is something closely related to freedom of expression. In fact, I sometimes say, not everybody agrees with me on this, that academic freedom may be the shape that freedom of expression values or concerns take within the particular context of the university and its mission. But in any event, academic freedom is rooted in the university's research and teaching mission, and it carries certain responsibilities and it's subject to certain constraints. So notably, as you all know, research funding, publication, professional advancement, and so forth are all subject to review based on professional standards, peer review of different kinds. Okay. I'm trying to follow some notes here, and I'm sure I'll deviate from them at some point. All right. Now, I think, and this would be how I would put it, maybe not everybody would put it in this way, the university's purpose requires also that faculty and students adhere to certain standards of communicative engagement. And in particular, that the members of an academic community should be treated as interlocutors, as conversation partners in some way, who should be addressed and heard. And so the objection, for example, to sexist and racist speech is not just that it's irrational, but that it seeks to undermine the standing of some members of the university community. Okay, now the advancement of the university's educational purpose and mission most certainly requires free inquiry and open debate. But there is going to be a tension sometimes between that and the importance or the recognition or inclusion of others in the academic community as members, as interlocutors. So for example, I would say, and not everybody may agree with me on this, that, well, it is important not to, and I guess this is the language that's used now, to misgender individuals if they've indicated they want to be identified in a certain way, students, colleagues, and so forth. That does not preclude research that's engaged in the question of the relationship between gender and sexual biology. That may be controversial, but that should be something that remains within the scope of academic freedom, even if how we engage with individuals in our community involves some respect for how they identify themselves. Okay, I guess also important to note is the university is composed of many sites or forums, each contributing in a different way to the university's mission. And it may be that the rules of speech are different in each of these forums. So first you think of the classroom. Well, a different higher level of expectations around civility will occur or ought to occur within the classroom setting. The classroom is, a hierarchical environment. It's, resting on the teacher's authority. It has a particular function or purpose, and so one expects there to be a certain forms of civility to be respected or honored within the classroom, and the teacher, of course, having the authority to direct the conversation in a way that is relevant to whatever is the topic at hand. It may be that when we think about residence, for example, the place where some students reside, where they live, some standards of respect or civility are appropriate, given that it's where you find yourself, it's your home environment. Okay. Now, outside of that, when we're talking about the common spaces at the university, then it may be the rules of speech should be closer to those that we would expect or enforce within the larger public sphere. But even then, it's important to recognize that the university is a workplace. It is a place where some reside and spend a large amounts of their time. And so when we're speaking about speech that is difficult to avoid on campus, it may be that certain standards are and ought to be respected. We get into slightly more complicated terrain when we think about extracurricular talks. a speaker who's invited to come to campus, speak on a particular issue that may be viewed as controversial by some members of the university community. Now, again, it seems to me that as long as that speech does not cross the bounds into the realm of illegality, it should be protected. At the same time, there may be members of the university community who consider this to be the place they live, sometimes the place they reside, and may take strong objection to the invitation of some individuals to speak, who they may believe are going to say things that are insulting, hurtful in character. And so counter demonstrations are pretty familiar now. And as long as that counter demonstration doesn't involve, I guess, what we sometimes refer to as deplatforming, cross some line into attempting to physically interfere with the talk being given, then of course it ought to be protected. Another issue that's arisen in a variety of contexts is the imposition of security costs onto groups that have invited a speaker who is perceived as controversial, and the institution fears that there may be protest, disruption of some kind. And I think security costs is a really, really difficult question or difficult issue for a variety of reasons. I mean, one of them is it can serve as an indirect form of censorship, especially if those costs are significant in character. It really may be impossible for some groups then to invite a particular speaker. At the same time, it's universities struggling with the bottom line in some way, can't necessarily afford to cover the cost of significant security at a particular event. I can't remember the figure, but I remember reading at one point the extraordinary amount of money that Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, had to put up in order to maintain security for many of the events that were going on campus. And it's a public institution, and the cost to them was extraordinary. So there is a really difficult balance here between security costs as a kind of indirect censorship, and at the same time, what can we reasonably expect of the university to bear as the cost of permitting various talks to occur on campus. I guess the last thing, and it's something I haven't really thought out thoroughly, and it's a difficult thing, and I'd be interested to hear people's views, is extracurricular speech by academics. So when you're not in the university setting, but you're out in the larger world, writing an op-ed, giving a talk, or now, of course, on social media. What are the rights of an individual in that context? And I think the general consensus is they have a general right to free speech, even though they may be identified as a member of the university community, as a professor of law or whatever discipline they may come from. And often individuals, academics, most often are going to be speaking about matters that are within their expertise, although it's hard to do that with any clarity on social media, for example. But often that's what individuals are doing, but sometimes not. Sometimes you have, I don't know, the English professor who is talking about vaccines being dangerous or ineffective or something like that, something that really is not within their expertise at all. And again, they may be identified as a member of the university community. So, what is the scope of their rights as an employee of the university? And as I say, I think the general consensus is that for a range of reasons, it's probably important that they have the same rights of free speech in the larger sphere. All right. I probably talked for less than you were intending, Bruce, but I guess, I hope that opens up the possibility of a variety of questions and things, because, I guess I could go into more depth on some things, but I hope that covers most of the issues that concern people.
Okay, so let me just ask a couple of questions, and maybe this will give you an opportunity to expound on some of the themes that you mentioned. So, I mean, I'm struck by this problem of academic freedom. Like, I mean, what precisely does that mean? Is it coextensive with free speech? Does it have some limitations on it that free speech doesn't have, or is it more expansive than free speech? And and how does a university, in paying homage to academic freedom, in fact, go on to reconcile free speech, hate speech, and political speech? So, I mean, what's the actual contours of this academic freedom, and how far does it actually go?
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't always feel like an expert in academic freedom, but obviously I had to think about it in relation to the freedom of expression right, especially within the campus university environment. I mean, academic freedom is the freedom to teach and to research where you believe you need to go in order to perform those roles within the university setting. I mean, that's what it, involves. It has it, so it is tied up with the university's mission of, you know, um, gathering and disseminating knowledge. So you have particular rights as an academic that if I were employed in some other context, I might not have. But of course, it's subject to limits of different kinds. The most obvious as a researcher is that my work may not get published unless it meets certain standards as judged through peer review. I may not obtain tenure or promotion to associate professor, full professor, or whatever if my work is judged not to be of high quality according to the standards of my particular discipline. So it has different restrictions. If I go into the classroom and I'm supposed to teach a course in constitutional law and I just start teaching something unrelated to that, I certainly can be called on the carpet for that. Now, obviously, the idea of academic freedom within the context of teaching means that I have a fair bit of leeway, but there has to be some limit to that. And when talking about academic freedom or free speech, whatever, obviously it's all subject to legal limits. Hate speech laws apply, whether I am out there in the streets and parks or publishing in a newspaper, or whether I am expressing views that would breach this law within the classroom or other setting on campus. So I don't think the standards for hate speech can change dramatically. But again, within the classroom, I shouldn't and can't say things that are bigoted in character that might not be so extreme as to breach hate speech law. And I think, as you well know, Bruce, but others may not know, is that hate speech law applies only to very extreme forms of bigoted speech. So there are lots of forms of bigoted speech, stereotyping, and so forth that are not, in fact, caught by hate speech law, but that might well be unacceptable to engage in with a classroom setting, for example.
Okay, so I guess we can agree that that academic freedom does not allow you to engage in hate speech, correct?
No. Well, no. I mean, it's clearly unlawful speech of different kinds, regardless.
It doesn't allow you to engage in things like bullying, harassment, or discrimination.
Right.
Does it allow you to engage in threats?
No, I think not. I mean, anything that's illegal, in the larger, sphere is going to be not protected as a matter of academic. It's going to be unlawful within that setting. The really challenging question is things that aren't illegal, but may be hurtful, offensive, bigoted in character, nevertheless may be in the university context appropriately subject to restriction because we are part of a work community, because we are in relationship with students within the classroom. And those are much more difficult lines to draw.
Okay. And so, I mean, you've made the point, and I think the point is accurate, that there are different, I don't want to quote the president of Harvard, but there is in fact some context here, right? And the context of the classroom is different from other contexts,
Yeah.
right? Correct. But going back to your social media point, though, if you are on social media and you're using, let's say hypothetically, university networks and computers, etc., what are the obligations in terms of social media there? Do they change at all?
Well, that's a really good question. I haven't thought much about the university's right to kind of control, its own equipment for certain purposes. But I assume since it's given over to, a faculty member for their general purposes, and most of us will use university equipment and even email for personal reasons at different points. So I'm not sure that would change anything. I should, you're just mentioned the Harvard president, as well as I guess UPenn and MIT and so forth, and how they were, and I'll put it in, scare quotes, caught out at this congressional inquiry. And everybody's pretty familiar with that. I think it's really, really important to note the differences in legal regulation of hate speech, for example, in Canada and the United States. A public university in the United States is, in fact, subject to the US Bill of Rights and the freedom of expression, free speech clause in the First Amendment. And as I understand it, even private institutions like Harvard have said, even though they're not bound by the First Amendment, we will adhere to the rules of the First Amendment. So the consequence of that is, even if there were students calling for genocide, and there was no particular evidence that that actually was occurring on campus, but even if that were so, that would not be unlawful under American law, which I find kind of disturbing, but nevertheless, it wouldn't be. American law can only catch speech is likely to lead to its incitement and character, likely to lead to an immediate breach of the peace. And so our law is different here. We have rules of that kind, but we also have larger restrictions on hate speech.
Okay, so let me just get two quick points to clarify. Does the principle of academic freedom apply to students?
No, I don't believe it. I don't think formally it does, as
Right.
I understand it. With that said, the university's mission should give students a fair bit of leeway in their research enterprise, whatever they may be doing by way of research, certainly doctoral students, et cetera, and within the classroom setting. But I mean, those are the places where students are involved. And those are places that are subject to pretty, significant limits or restrictions. I mean, I grade papers. I regulate what goes on with the classroom setting to ensure that the conversation is respectful of others' views and others' circumstances.
Right. So I guess the last point on academic freedom is, I take it based upon that academic freedom does not give you the right to exclude students from your class who may not share your political ideology.
No, I don't think it would. No.
Or who might even have a political ideology that you object to.
Yeah, no, I agree. It shouldn't. I mean, I could even have, a neo-Nazi in my class, even as long as they don't express, those views within the classroom.
Right.
It's what one does and says, as opposed to, what your
Right.
general ideology is.
Right. So a lot is being made. I only have a couple more questions, but a lot is being made right now about the university's obligation to keep students safe and to allow them to pursue their educational rights. And we saw, for example, and that's the sort of the obligation the university takes on. And we saw recently that the blocking of the Bronfman building at McGill, I was correct, that was that students were not allowed to pursue academic, their education classes had to be canceled, etc. How does the university actually go about keeping students safe and maintaining their educational rights,
Right.
at the same time as ensuring that there is freedom of expression permitted on campus?
Yeah. Yeah.
It seems to me not to be. It seems to be honest. It seems to me not to be an easy job. It seems to me, at least.
No, no, I think that's true. I think we know what the rules can and should be. One may have strong feelings, one may have the right to protest, but excuse me, but to block entry to a building, the university is certainly within its rights, and in some important sense, has some obligation to ensure students can freely pass into such a building. So I don't think there's any kind of question about the appropriateness of university intervention in that circumstance. It really is, the university challenge practically as to how they manage things like that. So that's not so much what the rights are as it is a matter of the logistics and the practicality of how you manage very strong feelings on campus. Mentioning the word safe, it's become a very expansive term. And, I fear sometimes that people use it in a way that is, I really don't like the views being expressed here. I really feel uncomfortable with these views. If we're talking about threats and intimidation, of course, that understandably described as making others feel unsafe and is appropriately limited, disciplined, and so forth. But the fact that somebody might have really strong views that I just think are profoundly wrong just can't be a basis for limiting speech or protest on campus.
Okay, a couple more questions, and then people, I'm sure, are anxious to jump in. Very quickly, what do you think universities ought to be making statements on political issues of the day?
Yeah, I think probably not. First of
the
all,
lesson seemed to be not is the right answer.
The practical lesson is absolutely not, because
right.
No statement you make is going to satisfy everybody. You're going to make a statement here, you're going to fail to make a statement there, or a statement that's strong.
Right.
So as a practical matter, it's just bad strategy. And once you've started down that path, then of course comes an expectation you will do it. But there's also a tension with academic freedom. So for example, I may go out and say certain things, whether in published form or as extracurricular speech, talking to the media on issues of free speech, that many people disagree with and find objectionable. Sorry, I've kind of disappeared. Okay. Anyway, many people may disagree with, may find objectionable, but it's not the university's role to either disagree with me and what follows from this is, or to agree with me. The university should remain above the
right.
different academic issues and conversations we have. And I think that's critical to academic freedom, that the university not itself be a participant in these conversations and these discourses.
Okay, two very quick ones here. The people here, and I didn't mention in my introduction of you, people here don't know that you in fact were the author of a report on Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act, which was a sort of hate speech provision using telecommunications equipment for hate speech, not very well defined, right? There's been a lot of calls lately to reinstate Section 13 or to reinstate some form of Section 13. You have any comment on that? Any views?
Yeah, well,
Are you staying away from that now?
No, not at all. Not at all. In fact, I've been doing a fair bit of media around this question. So, as many people will know, the federal government has introduced an online harms bill.
Right.
The core of that bill is really about putting a responsibility, a duty on social media platforms to act in a responsible fashion. And this really is just about uh, putting in place processes and systems for suppressing unlawful speech. So hate speech in particular, but child pornography, a whole range of forms of speech that are unlawful in character. And it's a complicated proposal, but probably the only practical kind of proposal method or approach to regulating online unlawful speech. I'll just talk about hate speech in particular, but and it involves reporting to consultation with a what will be a newly created digital safety commission and so forth. It's a pretty complicated system, and I actually, one has to wait to see how it unfolds, but it is probably the only sensible or realistic approach to trying to deal with unlawful speech online. At the same time, this bill includes a number of other provisions that are in some sense peripheral to this. And these have really been the subject of great controversy or complaint. So one of them is the criminal code includes 3 hate speech provisions. One of them is about the promotion and advocacy of genocide. And so they've increased the maximum available sentence for that to life imprisonment. They've also redefined the hate crimes under the criminal code. So hate crimes under the criminal code in the past, if you could establish that a criminal offense was, when it was committed in a way that was motivated by hatred, that could aggravate the sentence that would be available. Now the bill says any federal offense, so not just under the criminal code, but under any federal law, when motivated by hatred, the available maximum sentence is life imprisonment. Now, nobody imagines that the federal government is going to, that a court at least, excuse me, is going to impose a sentence of life imprisonment for some 19-year-old who spray paints a swastika on a synagogue. A hate crime for sure, but nevertheless, life imprisonment is hardly the appropriate sentence. And nobody really imagines that will happen. But the optics of having life imprisonment, it's just not ideal. And it's become a source of controversy. Now I get to your point, Bruce. Sorry, it took me a while to get there. The bill also proposed the reintroduction of Section 13 of the Canada Human Rights Act. Now, the old version of Section 13, which was repealed by the Harper government in 2014, restricted telephonic and, of course, ultimately online communication that was likely to expose the members of groups defined on grounds protected under the Human Rights Code to hatred. And the process that's followed under Section 13, under the old version, and it will remain the same under this new proposal, involved a complaint to an administrative body, the Canadian Human Rights Commission, which would investigate the complaint. And then if they decided the complaint had substance, they would refer the complaint to the Canada Human Rights Tribunal for adjudication. The principal remedy available to the tribunal is simply an injunction that would require the hate monger to cease and desist their behavior, their hateful speech online. So this got repealed, and there were a variety of reasons why it was probably not the most practical way to try to address hate speech online, including it within the Canada Human Rights Act and the procedures used for that. There have been changes and adjustments in this new version under the Online Harms Bill. One of them is to redefine hate speech in a way that fits with what the Supreme Court of Canada has said, its narrow understanding of what counts as hate speech, speech that vilifies the members of a particular group. So they've sought to do that. But I think the overall problem is this. The traditional legal responses to hate speech can't work any longer. They can't work because most hate speech is happening now online, on social media. It spreads quickly and widely, and a process that involves a private individual bringing a complaint being investigated, and then perhaps ultimately adjudicated is just way too slow, way too cumbersome to address this. And it's the same really with the criminal code. They just aren't no longer effective responses, if they ever were, but they certainly aren't now effective responses to the problem of hate speech and hate speech online in particular.
Okay, that's good. Last question.
Okay.
This group here is very interested in artificial intelligence these days.
Oh, look, I'm old. I'm like almost retired. What do I know about
you're
this?
right. You're almost here with us, but we're still interested in artificial intelligence. Here's the question. Given all of the stuff going on with artificial intelligence and the fake news stuff that was coming beforehand,
right.
Is it time to revive a false news section? Like,
Well, I don't, again, I don't think a criminal code response can address the problem. Yes, there is no question that disinformation is a gigantic problem. In fact, I have been willing to say that it's a much greater problem than censorship. You know, our focus when we're talking about public discourse has always been, oh, censorship, state censorship, maybe private censorship too by social media platforms. But the reality is that censorship is difficult anyway. And most those individuals, institutions, governments in the past may have sought by censorship as a means of silencing dissent. They now increasingly rely on disinformation, in which people no longer know what to believe, what to trust, or believe that which already fits with their existing outlook. So that really then gets us to the question of what do we do about it? And it's a huge problem. And it's not an accident that the online harms bill does not include anything about disinformation. I mean, other than the fact that, you know, hate speech involves false claims and so forth, but it doesn't involve anything about disinformation because, you know, it spreads easily, it spreads widely, individuals pick it up for whom it may not be. They may not be spreading it because they know it to be false. They may genuinely believe it. And then establishing whether something is a lie is not an easy thing to do, especially in the rapid online world. So it's a gigantic problem, and we have not yet figured out how to address it at all. Maybe we can find very particular issues or matters that we can address. At the moment, you know, the only federal legislation, at least as far as I know, that tries to address disinformation is in the context of an election campaign. Restrictions on false claims about a candidate's qualifications or the location of voting polls and so forth. But they're pretty limited, pretty narrow in character. Now, we still have defamation law, false claims about a particular individual that damage their reputation, and they can, you know, bring some kind of action. But again, the traditional legal response to civil action may not be quick enough and effective enough to address that.
If you figure out the answer to that, Kate Middleton wants to talk to you.
Yeah, well, you know, if she talked to anybody, it might help alleviate the problem and the gossip that's going on.
Right, I agree. Okay, sorry, I sort of monopolized that, but it's so rare that Dick and I are actually talking about substantive things other than our children. Okay, so anybody wants to ask a question, either put up a hand or unmute yourself or whatever and jump right in. That's it.
This is like one of my panels, really.
Let me come back.
Oh, hello, Bruce.
My,
Nice to see you.
30 years ago, we used to have lunch together, all the young folks in law, and
Yeah,
seems like you're now on the verge of retirement. This is very.
indeed I am.
In any case, I want to return to the American comparison, and you know, there's been so much focus on the presidents of Harvard and UPenn, and to a lesser extent MIT. But if you forget that, there's a kind of a legal context that's quite different. And what I'm wondering is, you know, are we in a situation in Canada where this is what I take from a lot of what you've said is we've relied on legal remedies, so investigations, courts, possibly a human rights tribunal, but we're not now in a situation where those kinds of remedies can keep up with the new context, specifically social media and fairly aggressive attempts, particularly from outside of Canada, but also from within, at disinformation. So we're kind of at is it a big project for legal folks to try to figure this out, or is it more of a political and a social kind of examination that we need to redo in order to figure out how to take some control over what's out there in the media sphere?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's primarily a political question about, you know, how one does this, but law people, I guess, have a role to figure out what strategies might be effective, what might be compatible or not compatible with commitment to various rights and so forth. So yeah, it's a gigantic practical problem. Now, I mean, we already begin with some controversy within the larger community about what speech should be regulated, forgetting about how we do it and how effective any particular method for regulating it might be. There are loads of people who still believe that we shouldn't be restricting hate speech, that the answer to bad speech, objectionable speech, is more speech. Now, I think that's to some extent unrealistic in the increasingly kind of fragmented world in which we live. You know, when I was given the task, I guess it was 2008, somewhere around then, of considering the regulation of hate speech online, and in particular the original version of Section 13, hate speech online was happening in these websites that were in the, you know, the margins of the internet that you wouldn't even know about if you didn't look for them. I was like surprised, you know. I thought, oh, okay, there's this and there's that, and of course these websites, you could stumble upon them accidentally, I suppose, but ordinarily that wouldn't be the case. And so generally the people who were participating were sympathetic already to, you know, extremist views of different kinds, but they would feed on each other in some way, and that's always the risk. They feed on each other, they begin to think their views are not so extraordinary, and they might be emboldened to take action of different kinds. So we certainly, you know, had to be concerned about them. It's now different. It's not different. It spreads widely, it spreads easily, but it still is spreading within these different networks. And so again, I can come across some pretty offensive stuff on Twitter or X or whatever we call it now. But ordinarily in my social media life, and I am trying to really limit that these days, I don't come across very much speech that might be considered illegal. But clearly there are networks of individuals, increasingly large networks, in which these sorts of things spread quickly and easily. So the federal government's online harms bill is really an attempt to figure out how to address this. And, you know, they came up with one plan that was heavily criticized, partly because the original plan would have required, following the lead of some other European countries, would have required the social media platforms to take down material that was flagged as hate speech in a fairly quick way. And the concern, and this has arisen in other jurisdictions, is that social media platforms, and there'd be a penalty attached to failure to do so. And the concern was that social media platforms might adopt an overly broad approach, and just to avoid any risk of liability, we just take down all kinds of stuff. And so that was one of the real concerns with the original iteration of this online regulation. Now, there is an attempt to place greater value on free speech within all of this. And there is no immediate obligation to take down material that's flagged as unlawful, except in the case of child pornography and what we sometimes refer to as revenge porn. So explicit sexual imagery of someone who has not consented to its either production or to its being posted in a public way. There is an obligation to take that down when it's flagged within a 24-hour period, and then to report this to the person who posted it, and then consider whether or not it in fact is unlawful in character. But otherwise, the new system, which came about through consultation with a lot of people, law people, but also representatives of different community organizations and so forth. Most of it is really just about pressing the social media platforms to design systems that will try to identify and remove this material. And it's an ongoing process of tailoring these systems in consultation with this government agency. Everybody knows that it will not be perfect. Everybody knows that sometimes material that is unlawful will not get caught, at least not immediately, and that some material that is not unlawful may in fact be caught up in this system. And it's about trying to tinker and adjust and get it as close to right over time. And at the same time, to create systems where individuals can say, no, what got caught here that I posted, is not hate speech and should not have been removed. So to try also create different kind of appeal processes and systems. And I think as a practical matter, it's the only way to go, however imperfect it might be, unless we just resign ourselves to there ought to be no regulation of hate speech, which, as I say, some people believe.
Yeah, there's been a lot of pushback, including in the who was Andrew Coyne in the Globe and Mail on the weekend.
I know, and they're really getting a lot of things wrong, and it's too bad. And I think the unfortunate thing is those peripheral elements, including the reintroduction of Section 13, are just a distraction, and they run the risk, as somebody described, like a poison pill, that the core of this, which I think really is necessary and is pretty well thought out, may go down with the whole ship just because of the addition of these peripheral elements, which are there really just for optics. And right. In the end, they're having the reverse effect.
And the same is true of the sentencing provisions also. They're just like a lightning rod for
and we all know that making a sentence a more severe sentence is not actually the most important deterrent to criminal activity. It's like the risk of getting caught. And hate speech laws historically have been not utilized very often.
And the maximums won't be in people's consciousness anyway, because courts will start sentencing much lower than that. They won't.
Well, yeah, when they have cases. We know how few prosecutions under the hate speech provision. And when we go back to Section 13, which everybody either on the one hand says it's vital, we need it, or on the other hand says, no, it's a terrible interference with free speech and it captures speech it shouldn't. There were so few complaints brought under it, and there were a total of, 13, 14, cases that were referred to the tribunal for adjudication, all of which it was determined breached Section 13, but they were all really extreme speech. Most of them were anti-Semitic, and most of them explicitly called for the death of Jews. There was hardly an over-inclusive enforcement of that law. So, anyway, I do think it's unfortunate that the bill includes these peripheral provisions. If they were really determined to reintroduce Section 13 of the Canada Human Rights Act, they should have done it in a standalone bill and have avoided some of this. But you're going to get this opposition. So Pierre Poilievre, for example, and I'm assuming there are no great lovers of him here online at the moment, but even before the bill was introduced, he said, I'm against it. I'm against it, and it's just going to be about what Justin Trudeau thinks you should be able to say and not say. And I'm thinking, okay, you're not that dumb to think that. You're just playing to your base, and it's just tragic. Anyway, it's frustrating.
Any other question? Sorry, Christina.
Well, I just want to intervene here. I was out of town and I did not read Andrew Coyne, and I just wondered if you could on Saturday, and I just wondered if you could just say a little bit what it was he said in order to understand better.
Oh, I'm trying to remember. I know I read it a little while ago. I mean, one of the things he targets, of course, is Section 13, which had been itself a subject of controversy before. And he was, of course, involved with Maclean's magazine when, I don't know if anybody remembers this, when there was an excerpt from Mark Stein's book, America Alone, which was, which is Islamophobic. There's just like no question. It's all about, how Muslims were going to take over Europe and they would use violence if need be and so forth. And a complaint was made to the Canada Human Rights Commission, and the commission actually determined, I think they didn't have jurisdiction anyway, so it didn't go anywhere because, or else, I'm trying to remember. No, it was the Ontario Commission that said, no, we don't deal with this. But the Canada Human Rights Commission, I think, decided that it did not have sufficient substance to be referred to the Tribunal for adjudication. But a complaint had been made under the British Columbia Human Rights Code, which includes, only a few of the provinces include hate speech provisions within their human rights codes, BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, for example. And so there was a complaint made to the BC tribunal, and the British Columbia process at the time involved no commission. Complaints went directly to a tribunal for adjudication. And so the case was adjudicated. Ultimately, the tribunal decided that the code had not been breached by this. But I think Andrew Coyne, editor of Maclean's at the time, has a real no great love for Section 13. So I think that was the focus, as well as the sentences. I think as well, there's anxiety, especially among those with a more libertarian bent, about the creation of a new government agency that will interact with social media platforms in trying to, adjust their systems for removing this unlawful material. My most, I guess, radical view, which is going to go nowhere, is I think we should prohibit social media platforms from gathering personal data. I think that would transform the conversation online completely. But of course, that's their economic model. That's how they do everything. And nobody is going to do that. But it might actually save us a lot of misery in so many ways. They just be
I think also Andrew Coyne, sorry, Dick.
Yeah,
I think Andrew Coyne is also expressing a sort of a more generalized discomfort with the bill that you find in the media generally, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're not wild about the bill.
It's interesting. I've been getting, for the first time, I think in my career, I've been getting a lot of inquiries from fact-checking organizations from around the world. Like one last night from Australia. I've had one, with a French press service, and one with a British press service, who are all fact-checking online claims about this particular online harms bill, and how you won't be able to say anything at all about gays or Muslims or whatever without risking life imprisonment, which are all just sort of absurd claims. But nevertheless, they're circulating widely because that's how public conversation online seems to operate.
Well, just to provide a little bit more answer to Tina's question, I think Coyne has, has been critical. He was critical of the Australian legislation and the confrontation. I was between, I forget whether it's Google or Facebook, but
Yeah.
always focused on the market solutions and letting the market regulate itself. And I thought this particular column just, I mean, I think this just repeats what you said, Dick, is that he's focused on the peripherals and made them into something far larger than they are in the context of the overall legislation.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect, and I don't know, and I actually have a lot of respect for him. I mean, his columns I often disagree with, but they're thoughtful, and sometimes they're really on point. But he's a libertarian. Yeah, he's as you say, a free market guy, a libertarian, and all those things. I don't agree with him, of course. And so I suspect, and I can't recall, that he probably has grave reservations about any form of hate speech law. Anyway, that it ought to be left to the market. But I don't know that, but I wouldn't be surprised.
And I just wanted to say, oh, thanks. Also, you had already brought it up, but the question about the difference from the US on hate speech, I'd kind of heard that. I come from there originally, but I don't know these things. But I thought there was a difference, and I'm glad that you clarified that.
There absolutely is. And I have to say, I can barely even teach some of the American courses when I do cases, when I do free speech. So for example, saying that, well, let me put it this way. Most Canadian hate speech cases are actually about speech that is meant to persuade, ostensibly members of the larger dominant community about the undesirable traits of, members of a more marginalized community in some way. That's what most of the cases are about. And so they do raise some interesting and difficult challenges around our commitment to free speech. Most of the leading American cases are about speech that directly confronts members of a targeted group. So when you think about the very famous Skokie case, where you have neo-Nazis who want to march in this neighborhood, predominantly Jewish neighborhood, which at the time had the largest number of Holocaust survivors. They want to wear SS uniforms and march through this particular village. And you're saying that's protected speech, because apparently they should all know that none of these threats were realistic and could be carried out. And you're thinking, that's to me, that's just unbelievable and remarkable.
Yeah.
And I just find those cases kind of shocking and hard to teach in the sense, because there's no room for debate. Whereas when I look at our hate speech laws, I have, I believe we need to regulate this speech, but I get the civil libertarian argument. I get that there's a legitimate contest about, well, what's the cost of doing this and so forth.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah, there's also a Burning Cross example too, and it's like,
oh right,
Really?
yeah.
What was that? That's RAV in Minneapolis or something like that?
Yeah, a makeshift burning cross planted on the front lawn of the first Black family to move into a neighborhood. Right. And there was a Minneapolis bylaw that prohibited hateful signs and symbols. And what was objectionable about that is it only caught a certain group of symbols, those that were hateful or racist. It apparently didn't catch others, like, I don't know, rainbows or things like that symbolize peace and love and so forth. Again, I find it a bizarre case.
It's always dangerous. And whenever we go to these meetings, it's always dangerous to try and compare Canadian and US, expression provisions.
Yeah.
I think we're at our 2 o'clock timeline here, or slightly over, actually. Any final question? Well, if not seeing any, I'm just going to thank Dick for spending this hour with us, a little bit more than an hour with us. I now owe him another lunch for this, but that's the best part of this. So Dick, thanks very much. It was really interesting and really informative.
Well, thanks for inviting me. And as I say, it won't be too long until I'll be joining you.
Great.
Excellent. We have an executive position waiting for you.
No, I'm taking on no executive position. Retirement must at least mean no
Yeah,
administrative
we
jobs.
definitely look forward to you joining us. And I just want to jump in and say thank you to everybody who joined us for this afternoon session, because it's been it's really good to see you all, and it's wonderful to have you take the time out of your day to do this. But a special thank you to Dick for taking the time out of your day for doing this with us.
Not at all. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.